Scott Cox here with Interface Coaching, a screen recording to go over intensity level and what type of muscle fibers we're recruiting. I think it's a simple way to think about our training and increase the odds of success as far as which interval type we might choose, to improve things. All workouts will help improve VO2 max, whether that's sprints or 3-minute intervals, 4-minute intervals, 30 15s, 40 20s. Tempo, sweet spot, FTP, or these VO2 max intervals. So all of our training is going to have an impact on our aerobic system. So VO2 max is our maximal aerobic capacity, and it's what I base training intensities off of. I think we'll go over some examples down the road. So my intent is to go over the muscle fibers here in a little more detail, and maybe how to figure out your VO2 max, and then what we'll do moving forward is I'll do 4 recordings where we take different athlete types. So we'll use the term phenotype for what type of cyclist they are versus sprinter, all-rounder, pursuiter, or time trialist. And I've got some examples of athletes that fit those criteria for the most part. Pursuiters are kind of rare, so that's a hard one to find, but I can go over that. And then we can go over that athlete type, and then I'll go over different workouts and what that might mean for that athlete, why we would choose it, or maybe why we would avoid it, what type of intensity we would use. So I think that'll give you some the answers. I think a lot of athletes want to know what should I do with training, right? Here's all the theory on the physiology and things. Some of us are interested in that, and some are not. And some just want to know what workouts should I do. And to me, that to get the answer, it depends, can be a little frustrating, and it does depend on some things, and it's hard to give that information in a recording or a blog. It'd be hard to put it in a book. Most of the books that are written are generated for the masses, so they fall a little bit short for each individual athlete type. But so anyway, I think those things are interesting and helpful. And hopefully, sharing things at a little deeper level will help you understand what your body type is, what your physiology is like, probably most likely, playing the odds, and then what type of workouts would most likely help you. So that's where I'm going with this down the road, but we'll start with intensity and muscle fibers. Coming down here to this chart, this is percent of VO2 max. So 25% of VO2 max over here and 100% of VO2 max here as far as effort level. Most of the studies are done based on maximal heart rate or VO2 max. If you're these athletes are tested in a lab, so they know what their VO2 max is. But I think if your heart rate maximum, that's generally going to coincide with what your VO2 max effort is. So we might see P VO2 max, and that's your power at VO2 max. So I think we can really start splitting hairs, and if we want to be completely accurate about how we're using these terms, because saying that you have a VO2 max power is probably not accurate. But I think for our purposes, let's just keep things simple, and we don't need to get caught up in the minutia. I don't think that's important. So we're going to use VO2 max as a power, and then based on that percentage, what type of fibers we're using. How do we know your VO2 max? I think you can figure out a few different ways. There's plenty of software that you can put your power data into, and you can do some testing, a few different approaches that will give you an idea of what your VO2 max is. They're pretty accurate, actually, probably within 2% of what you'd get in the lab. How accurate is a lab? Depends on how often they calibrate their equipment. That you could go and get an actual gas exchange VO2 test, and it might not be as accurate as the software, just depending on that equipment. So that's like our power meters, all these things. You have to always consider how accurate are they, and how much do I want to put all of my training into this one test, because there's always potential for error in anything we do. So like I say, you can look at your power and use some of the software like WKO5, and I think Exert does this. You can do inside testing. I offer that for athletes, where we can use the lactate version or the critical power version. There's nuances to that. I think that it's really a great tool. I know it's used by a lot of the world tour teams, but my experience has been you have to understand the model a little bit better to make sure you get an accurate test data. So inside is excellent. I think the errors fall into the user. So the person that's actually administering the test could really get things wrong. And then maybe the tests aren't as accurate. But I think if the test protocols are followed, and the coach understands what the inside algorithms need to be accurate, then I think you get some really useful data there. A lot of athletes don't want to test. Maybe they don't, it's expensive to do these things. I think you could just go out and do a 6-minute test, full effort. I think outside on the hill is probably your best bet because you're going to make the most power. You can sit, stand, it doesn't matter in that duration. I don't think, not in my opinion. When we're doing things inside, we're seated because we're checking lactate things. But if you're using critical power, just go make power for 6 minutes. So it's basically it's a 6-minute all-out effort where when you finish, you're pretty cooked. Falling off your bike, be safe out there. But you can take the average power, and that's probably your VO2 max power. And then we'll go over some examples later when I go over athletes and how to figure out, knowing that power, what is your VO2 max as far as, liters per minute, that type thing. Anyway, so this is probably your 6-minute power. And then the other thing that you'd want to know when trying to figure out your physiology, if you don't use some of the software or other testing or go to a lab, you'd want to know your threshold. And I'll just leave it at that. We'll just use threshold as the broad term. It doesn't matter if we're talking about FTP or anaerobic threshold, the few different things that are out there. To get accurate data there is your average power for a 60-minute time trial. So, Zwift races, some of them are quite almost 60 minutes. So you could do a Zwift race, and that's probably going to be about your threshold, what your average power comes in at. You could, go out, do a 60-minute climb if you have one, or a 60-minute time trial. I think, if you're getting 45, 50 minutes uninterrupted, that's probably going to be enough. I don't like the 95% of 20-minute power. There's a few ways to do that, but I just don't think it's accurate enough. One thing you can do is if you know that 6-minute all-out power, you can do a 20-minute test, and then for the first 4 minutes of that 20-minute test, average your 6-minute maximal power. So if you held 400 watts for 6 minutes, you would start your 20-minute test at 400 watts for 4 minutes. And then hang on for the next 16 minutes. And if you look at your average power for that last 16 minutes, and take the first 4 minutes out, that's probably going to be pretty close to what your threshold is. So that would be a way to potentially look at that. And then, say that your threshold's 300 watts and your VO2 max was 400 watts. So then you can divide that, and then you say, okay, my threshold is 75% of my VO2 max. And we'll get into those details later, but that's a good ratio to understand as far as maybe trying to figure out what your physiology type is like. So again, we got the lower intensities here and higher intensity here. I think a lot of people are comfortable with Coggins zones and FTP and good old zone 2. And where do those fall in here? Well, this is going to be recovery pace down here, so we're not really recruiting many muscle fibers to do anything. So not much is happening down here. So they're really not getting any training benefits potentially here, that recovery area. That's why it works for recovery, and why we don't want to spend a lot of time down here, because it's not really doing much. We start to get in here, and up to around 50% of VO2 max. This is going to be our zone 2 riding here. We're starting to recruit some muscle fibers. This is going to be the tempo area here. You might note some fast twitch type 2A fibers are starting to be recruited. Around 75% is going to be sweet spot to threshold. So now we're potentially recruiting all 3 fiber types. And we get up here, we're definitely recruiting all 3 fiber types. The fibers, type 1 are your slow twitch fibers. They are very fatigue resistant. As far as slow twitch, they're not slow. They just contract a little slower in relation to these guys. So, athletes with a lot of type 1 fibers are typically, they can be fast. They can sprint okay, and they can have really good 1 minute to 5 minute power. So these fibers still contract pretty quickly. They just are very fatigue resistant. So, having a lot of these as a bike racer is really good. It means you can go for a long time without slowing down, because these fibers do that. So having a lot of type 1 fibers is definitely not a bad thing. Type 2A are fast twitch fibers. These have a little bit of fatigue resistance for fast twitch fibers. And these can change a little bit. These fibers will adapt. You can make them more like these slow twitch fibers, or you can make them more like these very fast twitch fibers here, but these burn out quickly. So here's your pure sprinter. These fibers, they're explosive, but they don't last very long. These have some explosiveness and last for a little while. These are not very explosive, but last for a long time. The other thing we want to talk about these fiber types is, what type of fuel is used. These like fat for fuel. So these are going to burn fat, don't create a lot of lactate. They kind of a clean energy, kind of like your hybrid car kind of thing, electric car, you might think of it that way. These fibers can burn some fat. They also like glycogen or carbs for fuel, so these do create some lactate. So lactate itself is not bad. I think we've talked about that before, but it is a byproduct. So when we see that lactate's accumulating, the clock is ticking, and that's going to mean that there's some things are happening in the cell that we're going to have to slow down sooner or later. So anyway, these fibers are kind of a hybrid. They can use fat and glycogen. And when we start recruiting these fibers, these almost primarily use glycogen for fuel or carbs, and they create a lot of lactate quickly. So, just knowing your makeup here, having an idea of these fiber types, or what intensity you're riding, you have an understanding of what type of fuel you're using. Is you're burning a lot of glycogen or you're burning fat. So that's something to think about. The other thing is, the more you're recruiting these fibers, this is why different workouts create more fatigue than others. And if you're riding down here, an endurance pace, you're not creating a lot of fatigue because you're using mostly your slow twitch fibers that are fatigue resistant and they recover quickly for the next day. But we start to get up in here into tempo and higher, we're training systems a little differently. Energy is being used differently as far as carbs and fat, and now we're creating these fibers, and there's more fatigue that we're going to get here because these fibers are involved. So you can kind of think of this line here. It's how many fibers are recruited cumulative, and you can see it elevates as intensity increases, but that also means that you're going to be fatigued. So if you're training out here, you might not be able to train again with quality for a couple of days. Whereas if you're training down here, you might be able to do this every day. So there are other things you want to look at with your fiber types. So anyway, I think that will be a good stopping point here. So again, VO2 max is your 6-minute maximal power. You want to know what your threshold is. That's going to be what you can hold for an hour. Keep it simple and repeatable. I'm giving you a couple of different ways to go about that. And then, you'll know based on where you're riding at what intensity here, what muscle fibers are being recruited. So your zone 2, easy and base miles, it's mostly slow twitch fibers here and a little bit of fast twitch, especially if you're riding for longer times. Later in the ride, more fast twitch fibers are recruited. Again, tempo, we really start to see a jump in how much these fast twitch fibers are recruited here, and that's going to influence what these fibers do. Do they take on these slow twitch characteristics, or do they maybe keep more of the fast twitch characteristics? So when you're training in these areas, now you're potentially manipulating these fibers quite a bit, and you're also manipulating energy systems because your body's going to use energy differently as the intensity increases. So anyway, those are things to think about. We'll dive a little bit deeper into this with going over, like I said, a sprinter, all-rounder, time trialer, and pursuiter. I'll go over some common workouts for each athlete. We'll look at how they're making power based on contribution from anaerobic system and the anaerobic system, and what might be the expected outcome or adaptations from the workouts, and when we might use which workout for which athlete. So hopefully that'll help you understand things a little bit more and better plan a training week, and then what type of workouts you might want to use at different times, or what workouts you might avoid generally depending on what your goals are. Just remember something, I think it's a good thing to keep in your mind is, we can change our bodies quite a bit. So these muscle fibers can change, and we can train how our body uses energy. And we can make ourselves quite strong, but maybe we lose some speed. And if we we increase our speed, we might lose some of our strength. So we're always balancing that. And I think when I go over each athlete type, that will make a little more sense. So anyway, a good starting point is to figure out your VO2 max and threshold. And then when you're riding, on your workouts, keep in mind what effort level you're going at and how much fatigue you might be creating. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind always. All right, until next time, and we'll start off with a rider type and go in more detail. All right, we'll be in touch soon.